Hi everyone, welcome to the Chapter 7 lecture talking about survey research and sampling techniques. Survey research is a research method in which people are asked questions via telephone, written questionnaires, interviews, or through the internet. As you probably know, surveys are very common. Think about all the surveys you experience on a day-to-day basis, whether that be filling out questions about health behaviors at the doctor's office, or filling out a "How did we do?" survey after purchasing something from a business. And we see a lot of surveys because they are an inexpensive way to collect a lot of data. They can also be a good starting point for future research questions. For instance, if you want to change opinions about something, you first need to know what those opinions are, and surveys can help you to figure that out. When we want to know what someone thinks, the easiest way is to just ask them, right? However, that does mean that we assume participants are answering accurately. As you can imagine, participants might not want to answer truthfully depending on the questions being asked. Or they might not know the answers to the questions you're asking. If you want to know how many times people have ran a red light in the last week, they might not want to be truthful because that is against the law. Or maybe they ran so many red lights they can't even tell you an accurate number. So, some things to be aware of when asking survey questions. First is a response set, which is a pattern of responses to questions on a self-report measure that is not related to the content of the question. Maybe you were asking someone how much they like different products, but they come in a bad mood, so they mark that they hate everything. Again, their response set is not related to the content of the questions. Second is social desirability, which is a response set in which respondents answer questions to present themselves favorably. Maybe they mark that they like all the products in a survey because they want the researcher to like them. Or they mark that they have never broken a traffic law to make themselves look like an upstanding citizen. For the most part, we can reduce this by being open about the purpose of the research and ensuring confidentiality with the participant. But we still have to worry about the man characteristics, which are cues that inform the subject how they are expected to behave, including how to answer questions on a survey. If you're asking someone in an interview, how many times have they broken a traffic law, and you roll your eyes and talk about the bad behavior of other drivers, that might increase that social desirability. It can also be in the way questions are worded. If you ask, how many times have you put someone in danger by breaking the law? That can lead people to answer differently than if you presented a more objective question. When you are making your survey for this class, make sure you understand your research objectives. What is it you want to figure out, and why are you choosing this topic? Once that is established, you can decide on what questions to include. Each question should match up to that objective. For instance, if you're interested in people's buying behavior, you can ask them questions about that. But you wouldn't give them a cognitive test unless you're interested in how their buying behavior relates to cognition. With research, it's helpful to measure facts and demographics. I know I just said to only ask questions relating to the objectives, but demographics are important because they help describe your sample and examine if it's generalizable to the larger population. This would be things like gender, age, ethnicity, income, marital status, anything along those lines you may want to capture. It's impossible to measure everything, so choose variables that you think might create a difference in your data set. If you think behavior would be different for men and women, you should probably ask for a participant's gender. Surveys can also be used to capture behavior. For example, we might ask about someone's physical activity or how many times they've been late to work in the past week. And we can capture attitudes and beliefs. This might be, do you think physical activity is important for your health? Or do you think it's important to be on time for work? And those types of things. Question wording is also really important when it comes to making a survey. The validity of the survey, the ability to capture what we want to capture, is based on the quality of questions. To get good data, you have to ask good questions. Are the questions confusing? Are they hard to understand due to jargon or grammatical errors? Do they mislead with information or imprecise terms? To make sure you have good questions, make sure to err on the side of simplicity. Avoid jargon and technical terms. It should be easy to read, understand, and know how to respond. However, shorter is not always better. We might need to define for comprehension. For example, if we ask someone if they've had a drink in the last 24 hours, you need to define what you mean by one drink, such as one shot of alcohol or 12 ounces of beer. We also need to avoid double-barreled questions, where two questions are being asked at once. If a store asks, was the store clean and the staff friendly, and participants can only answer yes or no, participants might not know how to answer, especially if only one or the other was a yes. We also need to avoid loaded questions, which are written to lead people to a specific answer. You see these a lot in political surveys. Maybe you're asked, are you in favor of reducing the dangers posed to children by stopping the factory being built in our community? You can see that some information is being provided, but it's leading you to an answer that this group wants to see. We also need to avoid negative wording, which is essentially having the word not in the question. For example, if you ask someone, do you think the factory should not be built? This can trip people up because it's harder to process. It would be better to word this in the affirmative and ask, should the factory be built? And ask people yes or no. Lastly, we need to watch for yay saying, which is the tendency to agree constantly. We can also have nay saying where people disagree constantly. This tends to happen when someone is just flying through a questionnaire without really reading it. In this case, you would do an attention check. This might mean having a question with reverse scoring. Maybe you ask someone if they like to travel often, and also if they like to stay home often. That would be contradictory, and the response might get thrown out. We can also have them type out an answer to something if they've been answering multiple choice for a while, which forces them to slow down. For the activity this week, you are going to read these survey questions and evaluate what is wrong with them based on what we just talked about. Go ahead and number these 1 through 7 and state whether it is not simple enough, it's double-barreled, it's loaded, it has negative wording, or it might increase the chance of yay saying or nay saying. So we also need to be able to look at responses to questions because good questions need to be answered. And we need to decide if we want our survey answers to be closed-ended or open-ended. Closed-ended questions are those with response options provided for research participants to choose from. The choices are presented like a multiple choice test, and participants can choose from a set of answers. This is helpful for providing structure and making sure you're capturing the information you want. If you are interested in physical activity, you can have options for strength training, aerobics, yoga, none, and so on. They tend to be more quantitative in nature, where you can assign values to the responses and are easy to analyze. However, it might limit your responses. Maybe someone does another form of activity that you don't have an option for. And it's important to make sure your variables are well defined and participants know which behaviors fall into which category. Open-ended questions give research participants the opportunity to provide free-form responses in their own words. A question is asked, and if it's online or on paper, there's usually a text box to write in the answer. These do have less structure and tend to be more qualitative in nature. If you're interested in physical activity, maybe you ask people, what physical activities do you engage in? In doing this, you'll get a lot more variability in answers, which is great because it'll capture just about everything. But then it can be really time-consuming to analyze. You might need to go through and then categorize each activity yourself, and it can be harder to assign values to the responses. I remember having a participant who said that they liked to fish, and then the team had to have this full discussion on whether or not that was physical activity, even though it is considered a sport. But if you're unsure about what answers you might receive, open-ended questions are a good way to make sure you capture a full range of responses. Number of response options you have depends on the questions you're asking, but it can also change the data you get. With a dichotomy, you just have two options, yes or no, one or two, things along those lines. You might ask, do you exercise, yes or no? More options do give you more variability in your data. This might mean asking how often you exercise, and you have options for daily, weekly, monthly, never, and so on. Rating scales are a measure used to assign scores along some numerical dimension. This might be a Likert scale where you have 5 to 7 options and you ask, how much do you agree with something? And 1 might mean strongly disagree, and 5 might be strongly agree. Within rating scales, you can have a graphic rating scale, which uses a graphical representation of a numerical dimension. These use a 100-millimeter line anchored with descriptions at each end, and a ruler is placed on the line to obtain a score ranging from 0 to 100. The example in the slide shows a ruler with anchors of not enjoyable at all to very enjoyable, and a sliding scale in which this individual picked 4. Depending on the scale and the software you're using, sometimes you can only pick solid numbers like 2, 3, or 4, but others let you use decimals like 4.2 or 4.8. Qualtrics, which we'll be using for this class, allows you to do both. You can also have a semantic differential scale, which is a type of rating scale used to measure participants' attitudes about any concept with bipolar adjectives, meaning 2 poles of descriptive words, and participants choose where their opinions fall. So this example on the slide shows vaping. The first question shows 2 poles ranging from bad to good, and the second with unhealthy to healthy. And participants, just like before, mark where their opinion is. This is just like that graphic rating scale, we just don't use the ruler measurement aspect of it. Then we have pictorial or nonverbal scales, which uses pictures as response options. This can be really great for children or nonverbal individuals, but these can be used with adults as well. The first example shows a pain rating scale that you might see at the doctor's office, where people can rate how much pain they're in, and the second is a happiness scale. And then we have labeling response alternatives. How do we label our scales? You could have only the endpoints labeled, like with their graphic rating scale or the semantic differential scale, or you can have all options labeled. Maybe you've seen a survey such as the one shown here, where you are asked to rate your satisfaction with a business. And instead of just having the endpoints of very unsatisfied and very satisfied, each option, including neutral, is labeled. And you would change what these labels are based on what you're measuring, whether that be satisfaction, likelihood, agreements, frequency, quality, anything of that nature. The benefit here is that there's a clear meaning of each option. We don't have to guess if a mid rating means neutral or unsatisfied. These are given, so you don't need to write them down, but these are some words you could use if you create a 5-point or 7-point Likert scale. They are divided up by category, so you have words for likelihood, frequency, difficulty, and so on. After you create your questions, you need to finalize your survey, and much of this comes down to formatting. Regardless of whether it's on paper, online, or with another format, it should be presented professionally. This means we need to avoid spelling and grammatical mistakes. We should have consistency in design and flow, so it should be really easy to follow and know where to put our answers to the questions. And it should be clear what those answer options are. Then there should be consistency in the answer options. So you wouldn't have 1B agree and 5B disagree, and then on the next question have those numerical options switched, where 5 is now agree and 1 is now disagree. With the sequence of questions, the order you ask questions can influence how people respond. Most of the time, we want to start with the easy questions, which are typically our demographic questions, to get people warmed up. The exception to this is if you're asking a ton of demographic questions, because people might get bored, and in that case, you might ask the more interesting and important questions first, and leave the demographics for the end. It just kind of depends on what your survey is. All of the surveys in this class are relatively short, so it shouldn't matter too much, but it's still something to think about. You should also group your similar questions together. So demographics questions should be listed together. Emotionality questions should be listed together. Burnout questions should be listed together. And this helps with the flow of the survey and also the attention of your participants. Before your survey goes live, there should be some pilot testing done, where you administer your survey to a small practice group to make sure everything makes sense and is being interpreted correctly or the way you want things to be interpreted. Sometimes we use a small sample of people outside of what we are studying or outside of our group or team to make sure it makes sense for a lay audience. And other times it might be a small sample of those who you are studying, so it's audience specific. Again, it just kind of depends, and piloting both groups would be the most beneficial, but it's also the most time consuming. In this class, your classmates will be piloting some questions from your survey, and you can analyze that data. There are some considerations for when you're administering a survey. First is response rate, which is the percentage of people selected for a sample who actually complete a survey. This is important because the people who don't respond to a survey might be different than those who do respond to a survey, and that can skew or distort our results. You can imagine if you receive a political survey with loaded questions, some people might not want to complete it. And those who do complete it are the ones who tend to agree politically. So it's not a very representative sample. We also have to worry about interviewer bias, which is intentional or unintentional influence exerted by an interviewer in such a way that the actual or interpreted behavior of respondents is consistent with the interviewer's expectations. This is just like the other types of bias we've talked about, but it's specific to an interviewer with interview-based surveys. Essentially, we have to be careful and make sure interviewers are trained so they're not adding in their own opinions or expectations onto the participant. Questionnaires are surveys that are presented in a written format and respondents write or mark their answers. These can be administered in groups, through the mail, or online. These are great because of their low expense. They can be completely anonymous. Sometimes we don't even ask participants to write their name, and they're easy to collect in large numbers. However, there can be issues with interpretation because there needs to be an understanding of language, and participants don't always provide their full attention. And of course, there are pros and cons to how we administer questionnaires. If participants fill these out in person, one-on-one, or as a group on physical paper, there are better response rates and participants can ask questions, but these are very time-consuming for the researcher, and you risk bias such as social desirability. Mail surveys are less time-consuming, but they have lower response rates. And online surveys provide an easy way to collect and analyze data, but they might not work for everyone. You might only receive responses from those with internet, having a device, and those with an understanding of technology. So this does tend to skew younger with a slightly higher income. You can also administer a survey through interviews. These do require interaction, which means scheduling time and training people on how to administer the survey so it's consistent each time. Again, when people are completing surveys with some form of human interaction, there are higher response rates, but also there's an increased potential for interviewer bias. Face-to-face interviews are the most time-consuming because of the one-on-one and traveling aspects, and have the greatest level of bias, especially if there's just one researcher making notes and reporting from memory without any recording devices like we've talked about. Phone interviews are less expensive in terms of time and traveling costs, and are still the primary way of collecting large-scale interview data today. Sometimes there's a live interviewer reading off questions and making notes. Other times the interview is guided by a computer program and a participant might use a keypad to answer. Or there's an interactive voice response software that will allow participants to verbally answer the questions. Then there's focus groups, which are an interview strategy wherein multiple respondents are encouraged to interact in a group interview. These are best with 6 to 10 people. If we have more than that, we don't get everyone's ideas, and if there's less, we tend to not get enough variety. Focus groups are pretty in-depth and last 2 to 3 hours and are typically recorded to be reviewed later on. Participants are asked open-ended questions so they can dive in-depth with the content and build on others' responses. The facilitator plays an important role in guiding the conversation and making sure everyone can share their thoughts. And usually more than one group is examined. You might do this, say, 5 times with different groups of 6 to 10 people. However, focus groups typically only study one point in time. When we want to look at change in something over time, we create a panel study in which the same sample of subjects is studied at 2 or more points in time. So we might examine how student burnout changes over the course of the degree, or how political affiliation changes over time. This is a type of longitudinal study which we'll talk about later on. So now we are going to talk about the people we use in our research. A sample refers to the members of a population selected to participate in a research investigation, whereas the population is the defined group of individuals from which the sample is drawn. In other words, the population is the entire group you're interested in, and the sample is the subset you have in your study. Sometimes we can send a survey to an entire population. Maybe we're only interested in ISU students, so we send a survey to just this population. But other times the population is too big. You can't measure, for example, every child in America. Rather, you would need to recruit some children from America, creating a sample. When using a sample to infer about a population, we often give what's called a confidence interval, which is an interval of values within which there is a given level of confidence where the population value lies. So we might say that we are 95% confident that the population is plus or minus 3 points from the sample mean. We also look at sampling error, which is the potential deviation of the value obtained using sample data and the true population data. So this is trying to get an estimate of how different our sample results are from the population. And we can't always measure this because we don't always have the population numbers. The sample size, or how many people we have in our sample, is something we need to consider as well. The larger the sample size, the closer to the population true scores it is, and the lower the sampling error will be. If we wanted to make assumptions about all ISU students, there would probably be more error if we only measured 25 people than if we measured 2,500 people. But choosing a sample size is complicated and is different with survey data. We don't have an expected effect size, for example. So it depends on how close to the population you want to be. If you look at the image on the slide, we have a precision estimate with plus or minus 3%, 5%, and 10%, and the number of people you would need based on the size of the population. When it comes to sampling techniques, Probability sampling refers to when each member of the population has a specifiable probability or chance of being chosen. If we want to make a precise guess about a population, we need to use probability sampling. However, this can be really difficult to implement, and we don't often use it in psychological research. Simple random sampling is when each member of the population has an equal probability of being included in the sample. So everyone who visits a website has an equal chance of being sent a survey, for example. If you have 100 people in a population, each person has a 1% chance of being included. Stratified random sampling is when a population is divided into subpopulation groups called strata. Individuals are then randomly chosen from each of the strata. You can see in this example, people are divided up by education and then randomly sampled by high school only, college, or graduate degrees. So you're not pulling from the population, but from the group, so you are making sure you are obtaining people from each category. There's also cluster sampling, where existing groups or geographic areas called clusters are identified. Clusters are randomly sampled, and then everyone in the selected clusters participates in the study. So instead of choosing individuals or a group, maybe we're choosing 5 groups of 4th grade classes. And note that we're taking the entire group, group 1, group 2, group 3, and so on, instead of just looking at individuals. Lastly, we have non-probability sampling, in which the probability of any particular member of the population being chosen is unknown. This is still very useful, they just don't allow us to make precise judgments of the population. Maybe this means we are gathering a convenience sample, where we are selecting subjects because they are easy to obtain. It's convenient. A lot of research at ISU is done with undergrads needing course credits, and that is a convenience sample. Using your friends, family, and classmates is also a convenience sample. Then there's purposive sampling, in which we have predetermined types of individuals obtained for the sample. This is a form of convenience sampling in which we go a step further and only sample people that meet a specific criteria. I study food and decision making, and while I tend to sample college students, I have to make sure they don't have an eating disorder before we continue, because that will create some variation in my data. Then there's snowball sampling, in which research participants are asked to recruit or identify potential research participants, essentially having them go out and tell their friends so we can bring in more people. And lastly, we have quota sampling, in which the sample is chosen to reflect the numerical composition of various subgroups in the population. This can be convenience or purposive sampling, but there's a specific number we are trying to reach for each type of person. It's like the stratified sampling without the random component. So going back to that example, instead of random sampling high school, college, and graduate students, we would be convenience sampling them. When we are evaluating our samples, we need to make sure we are representative of the population. Maybe we want to make assumptions about ISU students, but we only measure men, or we only measure women, or we only measure psychology students. That's not very representative of all of our students, right? If we were to seek a completely unbiased sample, participants would be randomly sampled from the population and invited to participate. And not only that, but everyone would participate and no one would turn the study down. As you can imagine, this is usually unrealistic. Instead, we should strive to do our best, but know that there's no perfect study out there, and that we should be open about our limitations in the discussion section of our papers. Sampling frame refers to the actual individuals or clusters of individuals in a population who might actually be selected for inclusion in the sample. The sampling frame doesn't always align with the population. which means we can't always find or access everyone we're interested in. If you're asked to take a survey on a receipt from Walmart, only people with access to technology and the internet can take that. So not everyone in the population being those who shop at Walmart, is being accessed here. So identifying that and making changes when possible, such as having customers fill out the survey in store when checking out, can increase that sampling frame. So considerations here for when you make your survey for this class and also when reading research more broadly. And that's all I have for you. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out.